Hello, and welcome to the fourth session of Energy 101 this fall. My name is Kate Salamito, and I'm the Experiential Learning Coordinator at the Irving Institute. And I'm excited today to welcome Stephen Doig, who will introduce himself in a minute. But we have a great talk today about the promises and challenges of renewable energy. And the way that this is going to run today is Stephen's just going to go, and we're going to stop every 15 minutes to open up the floor to you all to ask questions. So we're going to do a sort of mini lecture Q&A, mini lecture Q&A kind of format. So hopefully that'll allow you all to engage with one another, engage with us, and break up the content a little. But we're also hoping to get through some good meat today, or tofu or beans or whatever you prefer to eat for your protein needs. Today's the fourth session. Next week, we're going to have the fifth session on the electric grid with Rosie Kerr, the Director of Sustainability at Dartmouth. So as you're hearing Stephen talk today, think about how what we're learning today is going to tie into how you think about the electric grid and how it should be transformed. So with that, Stephen, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself and to introduce the session.
Thanks, Kate. I'm Stephen Doig, Director of Research at the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about renewable energy and in a more nuanced form rather than just quote unquote renewable energy. And so just to outline what we're planning on doing today is want to talk about what is renewable energy and how do we evaluate it? What are the major barriers to adoption of renewable energy? And what are some of the bright spots for a promising renewable and sustainable future? Last week, John Jeffers, a Dartmouth grad, worked in the fossil fuel industry for many decades, spoke about fossil fuels, including what they are, what they're used for, and how much we use. Today, we're going to talk about renewable energy in a parallel vein. Just by way of calibration, the world is still awash in fossil fuels and is not going to, quote unquote, run out of them anytime soon. So that is not the primary reason to transition to other fuels. For example, coal can be converted to liquid fuels at roughly $80 to $100 a barrel, which is well below the price that it was in 2014. And the Germans did it at scale in World War II, and the South Africans did it during the apartheid era. So it's not a matter of running out of fossil fuels. In fact, in the United States, with at least 300 years of coal supply and fracking opening up new resources, running out is not the reason to switch. On this slide, though, I'd say I suspect that for many people in attendance today, the motivating force for energy transition is climate change. In this chart from NOAA, we see that this past summer was the warmest on record and that the deviations from the average temperature were up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's the red that you see on this chart. And so I think climate change is a plenty good reason to move to a new energy paradigm, but there are others like cost, environmental degradation, access, inequity of impacts that are also important factors to consider. For those of you who were with me 2 weeks ago and Amanda 3 weeks ago, Amanda and I 2 weeks ago, this is a Sankey diagram. To remind you what it means is that on the left-hand side is the sources of supply, called primary energy. They're things like coal, gas, oil, solar, wind, geothermal, and they are converted into energy services that we really care about, like hot showers and cold beer on the right-hand side, and they go into 4 major categories: residential buildings, commercial buildings, industrial processes, and transportation. Today, we're going to focus on the left-hand side of this Sankey diagram to ask ourselves the inputs to our energy system and how they can be made renewable. So to begin with, the title of today's chart was partly renewable energy. What is renewable energy? And here I've put up 4 definitions that I pulled off the websites of the EIA, which is the Energy Information Agency here in the United States, NRDC, which is a not-for-profit organization called the National Resource Defense Council that's been around for many decades, DOE, which is the Department of Energy here in the United States, and the European Union Parliament. And what's noteworthy here is that the EIA definition includes biomass of all sorts, including ethanol and biodiesel. NRDC makes the point that renewable energy was mostly what humans used for the entirety of our existence, since we warmed ourselves with the sun, put water to work, and burned biomass to generate, that was generated by photosynthesis. And that it was only about 500 years ago that we began to exploit coal and fossil fuels as high energy density inputs. They also point out, the NRDC, that fossil fuels are found in concentrated areas, lending to a situation that created geopolitical tensions. The DOE talks about clean energy rather than renewables, which allows for fundings in such areas such as clean coal. And for anybody who has an interest, I recommend going to the YouTube video called Clean Coal Air Freshener and to see what that's all about. And finally, the EU Parliament points out the negative effects of oil and gas dependence. And that's understandable since the Russians have cut off the gas line several times over the last few decades. And the EU is only rich in brown coal, a very dirty coal. And so they have a particularly salient need to think about alternatives. So there are many technologies that are called renewable, but the question today, is it really that simple? And so up here we have wave, and we have solar, and we have wind, and geothermal, and biomass. But what is really renewable energy? And so in this slide here, on the left side, what you see, pulled again from the Sankey diagram, is a set of different slates of energy. But the question, since we at the Irving Institute are the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, it's a more nuanced way of thinking than just simply quote unquote renewable. And so we view energy from many different perspectives, but our guiding star is to help catalyze a rapid energy transition that is affordable, sustainable, and reliable for the benefit of all societies. So we think about evaluating energy sources and their uses in a more complex manner than a one-word answer, such as renewable. We also recognize that all forms of energy at large scale create negative consequences, including solar and wind, but that some forms of energy are less negative than others. For each of us, and I'm not just talking about the institute, but everybody on the webinar tonight, is our personal perspectives and situations almost always have a bearing on our view of whether an energy form is renewable or sustainable or affordable. And so as outlined here on this slide, we really need to think about energy and renewable energy in a more nuanced way. And so the question called out here on the right-hand side is, how do we evaluate and compare possible energy sources of energy that can help us address current challenges? And the answer is relatively straightforward, but still complex, which is to take a system view. So when we at the Irving Institute evaluate energy options, we need to consider more than just the technology. Other dimensions are very important as we seek to put energy in service of society and the environment in which we live. For example, we need to consider the health impacts of energy options as well as their costs, and whether they pollute and who bears the brunt of that pollution. As shown here crudely in these dimensions, interactions between one of these considerations is important for another. And we can't consider them individually, but we have to think about them as a whole. So let's take a look at a few examples to bring these interrelationships to life. This is a picture of the Navajo generating station in Page, Arizona. This plant has been the subject of sharp attacks since it went online in 1974. In fact, even before that, when it was planned, because it became a very large source of air pollution that hazed the air in the Four Corners regions of the United States. That's the corners of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. It burned 260 rail cars of coal per day, most of which was mined at the Kenyatta coal mine on the Hopi Reservation, and spewed vast amounts of CO2, mercury, and other pollutants into the air. But it also generated the power to move 1.5 million acre feet per year. That's roughly 307 billion gallons per year of water to the desert Southwest, which was considered at the time essential to economic development, especially in Arizona and New Mexico, as well as Southern California. It also generated 75% of the economic activity on the Hopi Reservation and employed 850 Native Americans. It generated $100 million of economic activity in that area and provided an average wage of $110,000 per year. Another $50 million per year was paid to the tribes in royalties and other benefits. All of this in a region where 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. I happened to be involved, excuse me, in 2018 with the plant before it closed, as tribal supporters were looking for alternatives to the mine and power that could replace the economic activity it produced. Unfortunately, none has emerged, and the plant closed last year, and despite $1 billion federal effort to keep the plant online. Excuse me. So as a result, the skies are clearer and the view more beautiful from Zion, Arches, and Canyonlands National Parks, but not for everybody. Here's another example: big solar, good or bad. The Union of Concerned Scientists makes the point that solar has the potential to cause negative effects, including land use, impact on sensitive ecological environments, water use, in the case of concentrating solar power, as you see here, embedded carbon from manufacturing, causing mining waste and toxic materials. We'll come back to some of these issues later, but even solar is not without its own challenges. In this particular picture, which is an artist's rendition of a very large concentrating solar thermal plant that was supposed to go into Southern California in the Mojave Desert, was withdrawn last year by the proponents of it for reasons that are somewhat unclear, but probably boiled down to the negative negative consequences of the environment, that there was a fairly strong concern about the costs and real viability of this particular operation. Here's a picture of the Mekong River. I'm going to mispronounce it, but I think it's the Zayaburi Dam, which is producing 1.3 gigawatts of power, enough to power 1 million American homes. Went online last year. It produces no direct greenhouse gas emissions and can be dispatched as needed. But in this New York Times article, this is the headline, earlier this year, points out that the damming of the lower Mekong River is destroying the fisheries that supports millions of people. Pictured here is a river that is a beautiful blue that many of us might like, but it is not normal, because for millennia, it has been a brown river full of nutrients that created the world's most productive river, both in fisheries and the farming that went next to it. This impact occurred because of a single dam in Laos that was funded by the Thai government, but 10 more are planned on the lower part of the river, and many more upstream, affecting more than 60 million people directly. IIES, the Urban Institute for Energy and Society, is providing seed funding to Professor Chris Snedden and his colleagues to study the energy and society issues of the damming of the Mekong River. But clearly, it's not a black and white issue or challenge. It's in fact something that will provide both benefits and challenges, which brings us back to the question of what renewable really means. And
Stephen,
then
can I jump in
finally,
for just a second?
yep.
Yeah, just to clarify for anyone who was confused about the color of the river being indicative of the existence of the dam, it's just because when you build a big dam that holds water back, all of the suspended sediment drops out behind the dam, and the water that goes over the dam is sort of like lost all its nutrients, but is this like beautiful clear color. And the same thing can be seen all across the Western US, like the damming of the Colorado, for instance, has created a really similar problem.
Thanks, Kate. That's exactly right. And so what looks beautiful to us is not beautiful for the people who live there. And then finally on biomass, is it good or bad? Well, the college itself, Dartmouth College, had announced last year a large biomass plant to replace its aging and very old, 100-year-old combined heat and power plant that used number 6 diesel, number 6 fuel oil, which is basically a bunker fuel. And it's now reconsidering that, because if you think about it, if you cut down an 80-year-old tree to fire up your plant, when does it become carbon neutral? Well, roughly 80 years, and it's not clear we have that time frame. And then on the right hand side here, I show a chart that is for total production of ethanol and the percentage that has to do with the use of our corn crop. And as you can see, 40% of our corn crop farmed across the United States goes into producing ethanol that goes into our vehicles, which are incredibly inefficient and rarely utilized. So I always have the question of what will future generations say about us when we were using a major food crop to move around very inefficient vehicles. So I'm going to stop here. We're partway in. I think this is a great time, after sort of having teed up what's renewable energy, how do you think in a more multidimensional way, what are the questions that people have on their minds before we move on to the topic of challenges and barriers to more adoption of renewable and sustainable energy.
So as Henry did just now, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, or feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question directly. And Stephen, actually, maybe we can start with Henry's question, which is clean coal really clean?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it depends what you mean by clean. I guess in a world in which we could extract coal from the earth, not create acid leaching and other negative effects, which are really important and deleterious in Appalachia, for example. And we could capture the CO2, mercury emissions, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, then it would be clean. That in fact, we would be able to capture those things, put them back into the ground. And so the real challenge around quote unquote clean coal is how do you do that, and how do you make it economically viable? So for example, in Mississippi right now, there is a major effort going in to demonstrate at scale the ability to capture CO2 from a coal-fired plant. Unfortunately, that effort has cost $6 billion thus far. It's not fully online, and it has raised the utility rates for people who are probably in one of the most economically distressed parts of our country by 15 or 20% as it's gone online. And so I think the idea of clean coal, while it sounds nice, is one that suffers many economic and technical hurdles to show that it's actually viable. So what I would say is we should not dismiss it, but we should look at it in the context of other options and their costs, their impact, their technological viability, and the ability to put them in place relatively rapidly.
Are you referring to the Kemper County plant in Mississippi?
I don't remember the county, but that may well be the one.
If that's true, this is Tom Johnson. I used to work with Southern Company, and that was our R&D project with the Department of Energy. If that's the one, it was shut down several years ago, at least the coal portion, and is now a natural gas-fired combined cycle plant. And basically, the costs were much too high, and the coal gasification portion, carbon capture, will not come online. So that project was essentially shut down and basically a failure.
That sounds like a slightly different project than I'm talking about, because
you may be.
This is from a New York Times article last year that outlined the cost of what had happened so far, roughly $6 billion, and maybe that's the same, and the fact that it was not yet successful and it was driving up electric rates. But nonetheless, I mean, I think it's the same thing for us to think about, which is carbon capture and sequestration is a very alluring technology because, and there are very smart people working on that around the country, both in business and academia. There's a very, very sharp lady at Stanford who works on this and believes it's possible, but we haven't got the economics to work yet. And then you have to ask the question of, when you sequester that carbon, will it really stay there? And so I mean, if we can crack that nut, it would allow us to use available energy now. The question is, can we crack that nut quicker than we can crack other nuts?
Right. And just to finish, we scaled up 100-fold, and that was a bigger jump than we should have taken. A 10-fold scale up would have been much more orderly, and we just took a bigger jump than we should have taken, and basically it failed as a result.
Well, thanks for that input.
Yes.
All right, Stephen, I've got a couple more questions for you, and maybe a couple more than we can handle. So let's try and blaze through them if we can. Marjorie asks, is there such a thing as a green or renewable hydrogen fuel?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. And we'll come to this if we get to it at the end of the day, but there are definitely technologies available today, although they have a few teething pains to get through, where you can convert sunlight directly to hydrogen, or sunlight to electricity and then directly to hydrogen. And, just to say, and we'll come back to this later, there's the potential to use excess renewable capacity that currently sits on the grid, and there'll be more of it, to produce hydrogen at very, very low cost. We're not there yet, but there's definitely the potential.
So that's like midday when solar panels are producing excess energy that isn't needed, that could be used to make hydrogen. And then that could be used when the sun isn't shining.
Yep.
All right, quickly, what about biodiesel from like restaurant fry oil?
So I think that's, it's working. It can be done. In fact, there's a company whose name I can't quite, it's like today that I was talking to somebody about in Finland that is taking those kinds of inputs and putting them into biodiesel. It's truly biodiesel. They have two challenges. One, it's about 3 to 4 times more expensive than diesel fuel. So it's hard to compete economically, though with a carbon tax that might change. And there's a finite amount of waste grease in the world, unless people want to eat a lot more French fries. And so when you think about the fact that we consume 95 million barrels a day of crude oil, that's a lot of French fries. So I can see it playing a role, but it's probably not one that can be at scale. Though the caveat I put on that is, if we can convert most of our transportation vehicles for people and small scale goods to electric, we may not need that much biodiesel.
Mm-hmm. All right, speaking of transportation, Jeff wants to know, Jeff says government mandated the 10% minimum ethanol additive to gasoline. Can you say what is the relative efficiency and or harm to the environment of ethanol from corn versus gasoline from crude on a full cycle basis? So I think what really Jeff wants to know is like, should there be ethanol in gasoline, or would we be better off if that wasn't added?
My personal perspective is that we have not demonstrated that ethanol from corn can lower our greenhouse gas footprint. And I will come back to this topic later today, but it concerns me deeply that we're burning food crops to power very inefficient vehicles.
Okay. Jacob wants to know, is there a general rule for which quote unquote renewable source of energy has the highest benefit to harm ratio? Would that also be dependent on geographic region?
That's a great question. As the British would say, it's horses for courses. But solar energy is incredibly widespread. It falls on all of us, some more than less, but a lot. And to be, for example, the best place in the United States, let's call it Arizona, New Mexico for solar, is only 2 times better than one of the worst places for solar, which is Seattle, Washington. So that's not so bad. It's only a factor of 2. It's not a factor of 10. And that, in fact, I live up here in New Hampshire off-grid and have been for 7 years in a home that most Americans would consider modern. And I have a solar panel system and battery storage that, the solar panels are whatever, let's just call it 20 by 10 feet. And I have a battery system that has 20 kilowatt hours of storage, and we live well. So even in New Hampshire, where it's relatively dark and gloomy in December and January, we can live off the grid, and we do it on our own. If we were connected to other people, it would probably be more possible. So I think it's definitely, I would think about wind and solar as relatively ubiquitous and available, and therefore a direction that if we could head in and make it work would be beneficial to all.
Awesome. And the last and biggest question, of course, from John Jeffers, he wants to know, can you briefly discuss the current global contributions of various renewable energy sources, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, etc.? How much global primary energy share does each have, and which ones have the most growth potential?
We're going to come to this a bit in the next slides, but just very quickly to answer your question, John, when I looked up today, including hydro, roughly 15% of the world's energy comes from renewable energy. And if we look at non-hydro resources, it's probably between 5 and 8%. So it's a pittance. And therein lies a major challenge and something that we at the Urban Institute are keenly interested in, which is how do we create a transition from where we are today and facing the challenges we're facing today to a different world in the future, but we do so in a manner that is thoughtful, economically viable, equitable, and over the long term sustainable. And therein lies the big challenge of this century, I think, which is we have the opportunity, we're not there yet, so how do we do it? And we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
All right, Stephen, on that note, should we move on to the next chunk of
Sure.
content?
Sounds good. So, in this chart, renewable energy is in the news all the time, but is renewable energy still a tiny fraction, as I just mentioned, 15%. And without hydro, it's probably 5 to 8%. And without going into the breakdown of the different sectors and everything, it's not that large. So what are the barriers to widespread adoption of renewable and sustainable energy? And I'm going to put them into 3 large categories, probably unfairly, but here they are: technical, economic, and societal. And so Assuming we can at least see some energy sources as meeting most, if not all, of the criteria of being renewable, sustainable, and equitable, why don't we just flip to existing technologies? Well, if we start from a technical point of view, the key challenge is to actually one of the key challenges is actually converting our systems. For example, that literally means converting hundreds of millions of vehicles from using fossil fuels to using renewable fuels and electricity that are today largely powered by fossil fuels. And these don't exist. So how do you make that happen? Some sectors like planes, heavy trucking, and shipping require dense energy supplies so that their space for people and goods is not consumed by batteries or gases. How do we make that happen? And the sun has an annoying habit of setting each day, and the wind does not always blow. So what do we do if there is a day with neither, let alone a week or 10 days? So these are important challenges that we need to deal with, and we'll come back to them in a minute. Economically, regardless of what we might wish, economics will have a major influence on the rate and magnitude of adoption. We can't simply grant fund ourselves to sustainable energy, but luckily renewable energy is becoming more cost competitive and even beating legacy technologies today. And we'll come back to that in a moment. One critical economic challenge that is that as we adopt sustainable and renewable energy, such as wind and solar, we have lots of extra capacity that gets used infrequently. In other words, if you want to deal with a rainy day, windless day, so you say, well, we'll just put more solar and wind on the system and we'll pick up more of that energy. But the problem is that those installations don't get used very often. They're used on a cloudy day, on a windless day. And so the economics for them are very poor because you put a lot of capital in the ground and you don't utilize it very much. And then finally, on the economic front, making an investment, a bet, in other words, on a technology that looks promising today might not pan out if something better comes along later. That could lead to stranded assets, and that risk tends to scare investors. So for example, you might be really excited about a particular technology right now and you're going to invest in it, but what if in 15 years from now, something better comes along? So those are some of the economic considerations. And then finally, from a societal point of view, while I think the technical and economic challenges are important, I think they can be overcome. In fact, I'm quite convinced that we can make the technology work and we can make the economics work. It is the social and societal challenges that are holding us back. There are legitimate concerns about who pays, who benefits, a historical tendency that creates inequitable decisions on siting and local impact, and competing needs for land. And so probably the most important challenge we have is a lack of clear leadership and collective willpower to make the change. And so right now we sit at this crossroads, in my view, that says we probably can make it work technologically, we can probably make it work economically and be in a better situation. But if we cannot collectively have the willpower to move in that direction, then we could end up in this situation where we just dither and don't actually move forward. I'm going to touch on a few of these challenges and then we will finish up with some highlights on where progress is being made. So on the energy density conundrum, which has to do with things like planes, shipping, heavy trucking, this chart is showing us a couple things. That on the x-axis, the bottom axis here, that the energy content per unit volume is extremely high for gasoline and diesel, much higher than things like methanol and ethanol and battery types of all ilks, which are in the lower left corner here. And we also see that gasoline and diesel have much more energy per unit weight. And so with that conundrum, which is like these these fuels that we've used for a century now are incredibly energy rich. How do we make a switch when the alternatives are much less energy dense? And just to, by way of example, here's a chart. My apologies for the fact that the writing is so small. But on the left-hand side, what we see is a internal combustion engine powered vehicle, gasoline powered vehicle. And the circle in red is showing us that the power to wheels conversion is roughly 20%. So when you're driving your car, only 20% of the gas that you're burning actually goes to moving you, which is presumably the service that you really care about. Now on the right-hand side, that number moves to roughly 80% in an electric vehicle. And so efficiency and the conversion efficiency is really critical to move us, at least for individual personal vehicles, from fossil fuel to electricity. And because it allows us to use what is a relatively precious fuel with relatively low energy density, batteries, and make it cost effective. And today on the market, there's more than 6, maybe even 8 vehicles on the market that have ranges over 200 miles per charge. And so we're rapidly moving toward a situation where we can actually buy vehicles that meet all of our needs except very long distance driving. And they do not meet the needs of, say, heavy truck transport or planes. But this is one of the opportunities here. And then I guess the final thing I'd say about, although it's not the focus of today's discussion, energy efficiency is almost always the cheapest and most reliable form of energy that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I hope we come back to this topic in future Energy 101 discussions. Just to bring back the point that energy and society and our values are incredibly intertwined, think about the way our transportation, how we have to make trade-offs between urban and dense areas where we don't move much, suburban versus rural living, mass transportation versus individual vehicles, parents who drive their kids to soccer, et cetera, our desire for fresh produce in the Northeast when it's freezing cold, and our desire for local versus international vacations, heightened recently by COVID-19. And it's the decisions we make, the values that we hold, that often have a huge impact on the economics, on the technology, and our ability to quickly implement solutions that will work and reduce our impact on the environment and the climate. I'm going to run through a rapid set of slides, and I don't expect you to digest all of them, but we're going to talk about how you compare forms of renewable energy and how they compete today with more conventional forms. Lazard is an investment bank that's been around for many, many years. Every year they do a comparison called the levelized cost of energy. That means an apples to apples comparison in layman's term of how much different energy forms cost. And what you see on this axis, on the y-axis, are different forms of energy, starting at the top, rooftop residential, rooftop commercial industrial, utility scale, wind, gas peaking, nuclear, coal, combined cycle. So those are forms of energy, and there's another few dozen of these. And on the y-axis is the cost per megawatt hour, or for those of you who actually pay utility bills, the cost per kilowatt hour. And if you want to convert, you just divide the numbers on this page by 1,000. So for example, solar PV thin film utility scale, which is the third row down, at 32 to 42 cents a megawatt hour is 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. I can guarantee you everybody on this webinar today is paying somewhere between 8 cents and 18 cents a kilowatt hour. So clearly the solar PV at utility scale is crushing it compared to your utility bill. What you should really take away from this chart though is that thin film, solar at scale, utility scale, wind, and increasingly commercial industrial, and I would say this Lazard people are conservative about rooftop residential, are nipping at the heels or beating out conventional technologies like nuclear peakers, which are used in the heat of the day or the cold of the winter, coal, and combined cycle gas. Combined cycle gas is the dominant fossil fuel technology that's being installed today. And so what you should take away from this picture here, if we're not there completely yet, renewable energy is certainly getting to be cost competitive with conventional energy on an installed basis. So this is new installations. Interestingly, on this next chart, we see that new build wind and solar is actually starting to compete with legacy coal and nuclear. And there's no cheaper energy in the world than legacy coal and nuclear. And what I mean by that is that debt was incurred to build these plants, usually billions of dollars of debt. That debt was paid off, and all their costs are today when they bid into the electricity market is the marginal cost for them to operate, which in the case of coal is the purchasing of that coal and the maintenance of the plant. And in the case of nuclear, the purchasing of new nuclear fuels and the maintenance of the plant, which in the case of nuclear is a very complex and process that costs quite a bit of money. And so here we are in 2020 with new installations of renewable energy knocking on the door of legacy assets which only need to pay their operating costs. That's a very exciting development. And then when we think about energy around the world, not just the US, what this chart is saying, and I'm sorry, it's a very busy chart, is that when you look at solar PV versus gas peakers, it's competing. And so that means that if your house is producing electricity at the height of the energy demand in a late August afternoon, it may be cheaper. It may well be cheaper. And that wind in the lower part of this chart combined with combined cycle gas, which is the predominant form of new fossil fuel generation is going in, is also competing. And so, and it's doing this around the world, not just here in the United States. And then finally, because the sun does set and the wind doesn't always blow, it's really important to think about intermittency. And here what we're starting to see in this chart is that battery storage for short-term, short scale, and that means less than 24 hours, is beginning to become cost competitive with other options. And by way of example, XL Energy in Colorado went out to bid in the market in 2017, late 2017, 2018, and they got a response from the market that provided solar plus battery storage, 4 hours of battery storage at less than 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And so there's the potential, if you think about it, that in 10 years, that number could be 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour and 12 hours of storage. Because battery technology is right now on the same cost reduction curve that solar was 10 years ago. And so at that point, we would actually have a source of intermittent energy that's very inexpensive, solar, and a way to store it that's relatively inexpensive that could beat out other firm sources of energy, such as combined cycle gas turbine. And so I'm not suggesting that we'll completely displace combined cycle gas turbine, but there's at least hope here that we're knocking on the door of making the economics work for a solar plus battery storage system. And then I'm going to finish up by one of the concerns that many people have, which is that if we want to use renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar, we're going to have to paper our whole country with solar panels. And that would be competing with other forms of land use like agriculture, people, sensitive ecological places, our national parks, etc. But as this chart shows here, that little red dot, which is not quite the scale, which is a 50-mile radius, on that little red dot on a day with sun, enough solar energy lands on it in 6 hours to meet all of the US energy needs for the entire day. When I say all, I mean electricity, transportation, industrial processes, and everything else you can think about. And so I'm convinced that we can put in solar installations at relatively small scale, somewhere between 1 and 10 megawatts, that fit into brownfield sites, whether they're old industrial sites, along railroad lines, whatever it might be, that will give us a highly distributed network that is able to power the country. And this, of course, is only one possible part of the solution and not the full solution. But if you're worried about, is there enough land in the United States to power ourselves, that's not the primary concern I would have. So I'm going to pause there, Kate, and see if
Yeah, we had questions coming in as you were speaking. So folks, feel free also, we want to hear your voices. So feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in and pipe in, or if you would prefer to raise your hand, that would be more comfortable for you, feel free to do that. But I'm going to start to go into the questions that are in the chat, but also feel free to have us hear your voice or see your face or whatever. So the first question that I have for you, Stephen, is, do the renewable levelized cost of energy estimates include any cost for storage, or are those purely generation costs?
They're pure generation costs.
Okay. And the next one is about like the possibility of long-term storage. So Joan wants to know, what about long-term storage for wind and sun droughts, which do occur? What do you think about the practicality of wide area transmission to overcome intermittency when relying on renewables?
So, I mean, this is my view, and we'll come back to this in a moment if we have time for a few more slides, is that we can gain a lot by interconnecting our energy systems across our continent, because it's very rare that the sun doesn't shine anywhere and the wind doesn't blow anywhere. But we still have to deal with that eventuality. There will be a day, a week, 10 days where there's very low wind and very low solar. And I'm convinced that what we need to do is continue to pursue solar fuels, a term which means how do we convert sun and wind into storable high density fuels and liquid fuels. And so that could be methane. It could run through a combined cycle gas turbine that's only run 3 days a month. It might be renewable fuels that are used to power our planes so we can fly around the world once COVID-19 has been addressed, and to address things like heavy transport for trucks in the United States or the world, and for shipping around the world. So I think we're going to end up in a situation where we need to be able to think holistically about very inexpensive electricity from wind and solar, but the need to convert it into storable fuels.
Thank you, Stephen. I've got one question for you left. Well, it's really two, but I'm going to roll it into one, and then I think maybe we move on to the last chunk of content. So John and Jacob want to know, regarding the last slide that you showed about that one red circle being able to generate all of the energy that the US uses in a day. They want to make sure that you're talking about all the energy and not just electricity. And then they also want to know, does that take into account, if you were to actually only generate energy in that spot and then transmit it across the country, or are you taking into account losses in transmission?
Yeah, no, good questions. There's several caveats. But first, to answer the question, it's all energy. It's everything. Everything that we do in a given day, that much energy falls on a sunny day on that spot there. The question, though, is how much of it can you capture? If it was photosynthesis, it would be 4%. If it's current technology, it's 20%. So you need more area than I've indicated. But we can capture a lot more if we want to. So it might be 60% or 80%. And then that it does not account at all for transmission. And I would never recommend putting all of our eggs in a basket in that part of the country, because that could be an amazing target that would destabilize our country from a perspective of resiliency and security. And so what I would do is, if you take that spot there and you break it up into, let's say, between 1,000 and 10,000 spots, or maybe even 1 million spots, and you move them all around our country, acknowledging that Seattle's relatively poor and New Hampshire's not great and New Mexico is great, you get an enormous benefit in security and resiliency by moving that spot all over the country.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Let's maybe move on.
Cool. Well, let's talk about some glimmers of hope here, folks. There are big challenges. The upper left part of this chart, which I pulled recently from NREL and a Renewable Energy World report, which is admittedly dated 2013, show that some places, let's ignore Iceland and Norway. Iceland is all geothermal. They're doing great. Norway has an enormous amount of hydro that they use. But if we take a look at Denmark, they're at 50% renewable energy, and most of it's new renewable energy, non-hydro, because Denmark is actually incredibly flat and there's not much water that you can power there. Portugal has managed to achieve 25%. Germany's up to 20%. I'm talking about non-hydro renewable energy. And so that's quite exciting. Over on the upper right, Ireland has managed to get 23% wind on an annual basis. Wind, which is very variable. Well, maybe not in Ireland, maybe below there quite a bit. But you know, the current limiting grid of 55% instantaneous unsynchronous penetration. In other words, they have some technological issues they need to deal with, but they have even more wind energy than they can actually put on the grid. And then you see the charts in the bottom, which is just showing the growth of this energy, again, capping out at the end of 2012, and these numbers are better than they are now. So there are countries that are moving out, they are making it happen, they are overcoming the technological and economic challenges, but they're not there yet. This is a chart here for Puerto Rico. I traveled to Puerto Rico just after the big hurricane that destroyed the island's power system. It was a fragile, expensive, and 95+% fueled by fossil fuel electricity system, and where there was no indigenous supply of fossil fuels. I and Roy Torbert established a team, we were at Rocky Mountain Institute at the time, in order to develop a plan to adopt solar and wind that would lower cost, increase resiliency, and improve reliability. The latest plan from the utility is set to adopt hundreds of megawatts of solar and wind, and Puerto Rico has a mandate to be 50% renewable, I think by 2030. And this particular chart here is an actual, if you look at the yellow sticky note there, it's a first of a kind real world experiment using PV, solar photovoltaics, to maintain large scale grid reliability. So here in the United States, in Puerto Rico, in a place that desperately needs lower costs, needs a stable and reliable system, multiple experiments are going on to actually show how solar and wind can be introduced at the microgrid scale, the macrogrid scale, to provide energy reliably and more cost effectively than the old system, and do so in a way that is reliable and providing all of the services of the grid. This is a more detailed study of work that was started in 2008 and 2009 called REF, Renewable Energy's Future. It was led by National Renewable Energy Laboratory out of Golden, Colorado. I was part of that study. And we looked at the opportunity to power the United States by interconnecting the grid, so this came up earlier, across the US system, and what would happen because of the fact that there are uncoupling of wind and solar. Where does the winds blow and where does the sun shine across the United States, which is a vast area. That study showed that we could get to 80% renewable adoption by interconnecting our power systems and using that to power our country. In this particular study here that I'm showing you, which was for the eastern part of the United States, from Florida up to Maine and out to as far as, I guess, Minnesota. It just demonstrated that a very large power system can operate at a 5-minute dispatch interval, like connecting these things and trading power with only 5 minutes of notice with 30% variable renewable energy. So this kind of modeling shows us that it's definitely possible to adopt much higher levels of renewable energy than we have thus far, even if they are intermittent in nature, and do so cost effectively.
So Stephen, just to clarify, the issue that you're pointing out here is that some regions of the country have a lot of supply, others don't have as many resources, but if you pool all of the resources together and give everyone access, you can get a lot more renewables being used.
Yes, thank you, Kate, that's right.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to finish up with 2 last slides in a few minutes. This is one of my pet things, which is the Holy Grail, which I think we should all be thinking about, which is on the left side, we take sunlight and water and produce hydrogen and oxygen. On the right side, we take hydrogen and oxygen, we produce electricity, heat, and we get the water back. These systems exist, they work. The challenges are, how do we make them work long-term? How do we make them cost-effective? But imagine if we could drive towards this system collectively as a country and a world in which we would have storable energy at reasonable costs distributed around our country and around the world that would be very secure and reliable. This is technically possible. It's more a matter of willpower and costs. And we can make that happen if we put our minds and our efforts and our energies against it. And then I'll just finish up with this little chart here. On the left side, New York City, 1900. I've circled the car. On the right side, it's 13 years later. Can you find the horse and buggy? So we've done this before. It's not really a technical and economic challenge. Yes, there are things to be overcome. It's a question of willpower and making it work, from my perspective. So with that, I'll finish up, and thanks. Happy to take any last minute questions. I know we're at time, Kate.
Yeah, why don't we just save a minute at the end for folks to just hop in, unmute themselves, and ask any questions they have. For those of you who have to hop off, feel free to do so. We'll see you here next week for session 5, which is going to be all about the electric grid, and that'll be led by Rosie Kerr. So thank you all so much for coming tonight, and we hope to see you next week. If you want to stay for a minute or two to ask questions or hear others' questions be answered, feel free to do that. But otherwise, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Stephen and Kate.
Thank you, Nancy. All right, John, do you want to hop in and ask your question?
Yeah, I hate to ask all the questions, but I had a quick one, Stephen. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a whole lot of stuff. I guess you talked kind of around the cost side and the economic side, but I think obviously one of the great challenges is the financial and some of the natural resource constraints in terms of actually achieving, whatever that would be, a 10 or 20-fold increase in solar and wind globally. So can you talk a little bit about what, how much would have to be invested and who would invest it, and also some of the, I know we hear a lot about some of the scarce materials, particularly for photovoltaics and to a lesser extent for wind turbine generation systems, and some of the issues associated with sourcing those globally.
Sure. I mean, I would actually turn it around a little bit. Yeah, John. To me, silicon solar panels have about 2 years of embedded energy in them before they pay back, and the amount of materials they use that are relatively rare or hard to extract is extremely small. When you build a modern solar cell today, you literally are diffusing in small amounts of material. So I don't actually see that as a really big challenge. And in fact, compared to cadmium telluride solar panels, where cadmium is a pretty nasty poisonous material, I think silicon solar PV is relatively benign, and I don't see scaling that up is that big of a challenge in terms of the resource extraction part. When it comes to wind turbines, there is a fairly high use of rare earths right now. And there's a lot of effort going on, right, including at Dartmouth, actually, to say, how do we create really strong magnets that don't use rare earths? And there's certainly some promising leads on that front, but it's certainly something we need to think about and move forward on. And for example, in lithium, which is being used now in lithium batteries, especially for transportation, there are concerns about not only the availability of that supply and the security of that supply, but also the unintended consequence of the environmental degradation that would occur from extraction. I remain hopeful, but I have less certainty there that there are other battery technologies based on manganese, based on iron, that may help us out. And for example, Toyota is still very bullish on a hydrogen-powered car, and so there may be other alternatives that may come out from the wings. But so I mean, my feeling is we can manage that, but it's not something we should ignore. And if we have to rip up, so I think there's a way forward. And actually, we didn't talk about it today, but a big piece of that is energy efficiency, and how do we just need less energy to do the same level of services.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to feed you just one more question from the chat, and then I think we should all we should let you go, and we should all, go eat our bowl of ice cream and go to bed. The question I'm going to give you is from Anson, and Anson wants to know, can you expand on land uses and NIMBY challenges if possible?
Well, I guess what I would say is, for example, I worked in the island nations of the Eastern Caribbean for a number of years. And there, when you suggest putting in solar energy or wind that will reduce costs and make the island more sustainable, people immediately ask the question of where you're going to put the solar panels or the wind turbines, because you live on a small island. And in the Eastern Caribbean, many of which are volcanic, lots of the land is relatively vertical. So there's not very much available land. And so, for example, when we worked in St. Lucia and we put in a 3 megawatt solar plant, which was roughly 7% of the generating capacity of the island, it was really important to think about where we put it. And ultimately it ended up along the side of the landing strip of the airport there, the northern end of the island's airport. And so it was relatively little disruption for people and didn't compete for land that was already very precious. And so I think, that brings to the point, which is, it's easy to say, well, let's just put it here, but you have to think about the societal consequences. I think another example is Cape Wind off the Cape Cod. For years and years now, people have fought putting those wind turbines in because it was going to obstruct their view of the ocean. I'm very sympathetic to that. I actually think looking at the ocean unfettered is a nice thing to do. It might help to relax the rules on having blinking red and white strobe lights at night, so you don't have to look at those out over the ocean, and try to embrace the beauty of some wind turbines out on the ocean. But that's my view, and other people have other views. And so it's easy to always put the energy somewhere else. It's hard for us to grasp that every single one of us has to make probably some level of sacrifice. So for example, where I live off the grid here in Lyme, some people would take real exception to the fact that around all this green beauty, I have this set of solar panels built onto a relatively ugly solar panel rack. I try to wake up every morning and look at it and go, isn't it a miracle that I can power my home with no moving parts?
Well, Stephen, that sounds like a great note to end on. Thanks so much for everyone who chose to stick around and hear the these questions. And thanks so much to you, Stephen, for this great chat.
Steve, I'd like to just echo John Jeffers' comments that I've learned a lot. I appreciate it, especially interested in the solar panel, cost of investment versus return on investment comparison, because that's not something that everybody is well aware of, and myself included.
Well, thanks for joining, Richard.